Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Friday, January 29th, 2021. On today's episode, we're going to have a spoiler-filled discussion about WandaVision Episode 4, We Interrupt This Program. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta, and joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Weekend Editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
And special guest from the MCU Fan Show, we have Shawn Gerber.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Peter and Brad, for having me.
On the Mandalorian podcast, we have Brian Young, who I like to say is like one of the smartest people I know in like the Star Wars universe. Like he knows more about Star Wars than anybody else that I know. And I feel like the counterpart to him in the Marvel universe is you. So I'm happy to have you on here because I originally tried to get you on for the first couple episodes. You were too busy for us, but you know what? This is a good episode to have you on for, I think.
Yeah, I'm really excited that it worked out for this week because I figured as we get closer, and we're not quite there yet, we're episode 4 of 9, but as we're getting closer to the midpoint of the season, this is certainly when we expect the larger turning points. So I'm really excited to be a part of this one. And it was definitely a good one to talk about. So I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah. With all these episodes, we have the 4 segments. We'll go into feedback from last week's episode. We'll have a brief reaction, and then we'll follow that up with like a scene-by-scene breakdown and into our speculation. So let's start things off with things we have kind of learned since we last recorded last week. Someone on Twitter pointed out to us that the Doctor, who's actually named Dr. Nielsen, that's not something we brought up on this podcast. I know, Shawn, I think you brought that up on your podcast.
I did.
You're also doing like WandaVision breakdowns on
Yes.
MCU Fan Show. So Nielsen is the ratings. They track how many people are watching episodes on television, or they were. I don't know. I feel like now with streaming, it's very hard to track that stuff. But yeah, so I think that name is not coincidental. And someone pointed out on Twitter that the Doctor was headed to Bermuda, which is known to have a triangle that people have been trapped into and have disappeared in. Brad, any thoughts on that? Is that was that there for a reason?
Yeah, I'm sure it's a fun little reference to what's happening. I mean, as we've learned, in these first 3 episodes, and especially with things that happened in the 4th episode, I don't think there's much of anything in here that is a coincidence. This is all even the smallest details seem to be meticulously planned and like at least subtly referencing something.
Shawn, I feel like on this podcast we've been like full lost mode. We're like analyzing things in the background and stuff like that, and like sometimes I feel like in the first couple episodes, I felt like we might be over analyzing things and reading into things. Like we're looking at, what's her name? Agnes?
Yes.
Yeah, her name and how it's spelt out, and maybe that's like another Marvel character, which we'll get into later, I'm sure. We were making all these connections, like hexagons. Like, should we be looking into this? And I feel like that finally this episode, like, feels like a vindication of sorts, because at one point I was worrying that we were becoming like the conspiracy theory people that were like looking too far into things. Like, did you feel that at all when you were recapping these episodes on your podcast?
Absolutely. I mean, I was certainly worried that in doing these recaps and thinking I'm just being way too granular about this and thinking that every single thing that's in the frame or spoken or looked at and just everything is a clue for something. And obviously, it's not going to turn out that everything will have meant something significant over the course of the show. But until this week, it was really hard to narrow our focus. So you have to take all of it as we're just desperately trying to figure out what exactly is going on here. And I mean, we'll get into it when we talk about the episode in detail, but even with something they've given us to try and narrow our focus, I still don't know if that's enough for me to cancel out all these other theories that we've been thinking about for the past few weeks.
I think it cancels out maybe a couple of them. I don't know. Well, actually, you had a lot more theories on your podcast.
Yeah.
We did on ours. One thing I wanted to mention is last week we mentioned that they produced some replicas of the rings that Wanda and Vision had at the end of episode 2. And this week they announced a replica of the Strucker watch that
Yep.
was in the commercial of what, episode 3? No,
Episode 2.
2.
Episode 2.
Yeah, so they're I don't know. They seem like to be way ahead of like the gravy train. Like it feels like Mandalorian. They didn't know what was coming, and this time they do.
Well,
with
it
the
also
mark.
feels kind of like season 2 of Mandalorian, though, because they had it all prepped. Like they had
Yeah.
their Mando Mondays series, so and obviously they had, I think, greater partnership ahead of time with all of their licensees on this stuff for Mando and then now for WandaVision, because they've done that. They've taken Mando Mondays and now they have Marvel must-haves for Mondays, and it's going to be like this from now on with Disney Plus, from WandaVision through Falcon and Winter Soldier, and I'm sure when the Star Wars series come back, it's going to be that too.
Wow. Okay, we got a lot of emails in the past week, but to be honest with you, a lot of them have theories that either pan out or don't pan out in this episode. So they're probably not worth reading. So I apologize to all the people who wrote in, but if you want to write in after seeing this episode with stuff we missed or theories or, things, just anything you have for us, peter@slashfilm.com is the email to do that too. James from Colorado Springs wrote in. He wanted to alert us that WandaVision kind of echoes a very famous 1961 episode of The Twilight Zone. It's Twilight Zone episode 73, It's a Good Life. I'm not sure if you guys have seen this, but I'm going to read from what James wrote here. This brilliant piece of slow burn horror has a plot that potentially mirrors what is happening in WandaVision. A boy with apparently godlike powers has pulled his hometown, Peaksville, Ohio, into an isolated reality, trapping its inhabitants in a universe at the mercy of his whims. While trying to make a nice world for himself and others, he commonly maims, kills others, and causes disasters through his interventions in his pocket reality. Because of this, the town folks, prisoners and playthings in Anthony's scenarios, respond to every situation with feigned happiness, describing every situation as good to avoid his anger or the risk that he will cause even worse situation if he tries to fix his mistakes. In WandaVision, this could explain the reactions of some of the other inhabitants of WandaVision's Westview, trapped in this isolated town by grief-stricken Wanda's reality warping powers. I think this is dead on, right? Do you think?
Yeah.
Sounds like the show I'm watching.
Yeah, it's definitely very similar. Also, it's worth mentioning that It's a Good Life was also remade for Twilight Zone, the movie.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I gotta go revisit that movie. I haven't seen that in many years. The last thing I wanted to mention is it seems like Disney... It seems to me, at least, that Disney has been kind of unconfident in the response to these first few episodes. Like they're like with Mandalorian, I feel like we got nothing, right? Like they're not showing us previews, they're not giving us interviews with people. But every week, like we're offered like a new interview with the cast members, and like this week, like we got clips like that kind of like were a reveal of, look, this isn't just going to be the sitcom. If you guys are worried about this being a sitcom and you're a Marvel fan, this is going to get more Marvel. Keep on to this. Like, I love the show. I'm not saying anything bad about the show. I feel like all three of us are in the bag here for this.
Absolutely.
Like we're people that are supposed to love this, but I also understand that there's probably people that are teenagers, 20s, maybe even early 30s that haven't watched old sitcoms and didn't watch Nick at Night like I did, and are probably like, what is going on here? Like, do you guys feel the same way that I do? That like it seems like Disney was kind of worried that they might be losing Marvel fans with the first few episodes?
The clip and the sizzle reel that they put out Thursday morning, it played a little desperate to me. It did. I'm usually on board with, I think Disney's very smart about the marketing that they do, and Kevin Feige is always gushing about how wonderful of a job Disney does marketing all of Marvel Studios stuff. But it did play like they're a little worried that people aren't on board with the sitcom idea, and maybe are worried that that's all that it is. But I also felt like it was redundant because the end of episode 3 shows you very clearly. I mean, the end of episode 1 pulls back and shows who, well, I don't know if we're talking
Yeah.
spoilers yet from the episode, but it pulls back and it does show like that somebody else is watching something here, that there's a world outside of this. And episode 3 makes that very, very clear. So I don't know why they felt the need to show as much as they did. And maybe I'm just assuming too much, and maybe this was the plan all along, that they have their spots and what they're going to market and show when, that it's all been laid out well in advance, and they're not reacting to any of the reaction online, which is still mostly positive from what I've seen with respect to WandaVision. But as a viewer who was already locked in, ready to watch the show at midnight Pacific time Thursday night, I could have done without that spot, especially a couple of the visuals in it, like the big board with, IDing the different people in the town. Could have done without that. But yeah, I was a little confused as to why they were showing so much and not playing things closer to the vest.
Yeah, I've seen like complaints from people, and it's usually just the more casual viewers who are like, they're probably not paying like tons of attention to the marketing, and like they're just waiting to see what happens, and they like want to avoid everything at all costs. And I think that like they're watching the show and they're like worried, like, wow, this is all it is. Like, this is supposed to be a Marvel show, and like people are saying that they were bored. And I think a lot of this also comes from people who aren't super familiar with like classic television and don't understand what they're trying to do by opening the show like this, and realize that the things in these first few episodes make what's happening now that much more impactful and eerie, and suspenseful and mysterious, and so the complaints are unwarranted. The marketing definitely feels reactionary, but at the same time, Marvel does know what they're doing, so maybe they assumed that this was how they were going to play it out the entire time. But
right.
hopefully people stop griping about it, because now they're getting the Marvel side of what they really want. So
yeah, I wonder if there's going to be like this kind of like Last Jedi kind of reaction to this, where there's people that kind of like the sitcom aspect of the show, and now that it's going full on Marvel, if they're gonna like be like, I liked it the way it was, and now the people that are like didn't like the sitcom and now like that it's full on MCU, or like I wonder if there's gonna be a clash of ideals there, but
I certainly hope not. Like, this is what we've been told was coming the entire time.
I know.
We have been told that this was a mashup of classic sitcom and MCU epic. And even Paul Bettany, bless his heart, has been trying to tell us like the pacing of how this is going to go. We're going to start in sitcom land and we're going to transition out of that. But there's still plenty of sitcom left in this show. We know that we still have to go to the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. There's plenty of sitcom clips from trailers and TV spots that we haven't seen yet. So there's plenty more where the first 3 episodes came from.
Okay, we'll get into that later. Let's get into our brief thoughts. I'll give you my quick brief thoughts and I'll go to Sean and then Brad. But this does feel more like a Marvel movie. Albeit maybe the zanier supporting character storyline of a Marvel movie, which some people might not like, but it does feel very much more Marvel, and that's not meant. I guess that is a backhanded compliment of sorts. But it's funny how the characters in the show are asking all the questions that we've been asking for the last few weeks, and I love movies and TV shows that show events from multiple point of views, and this does that, and I honestly didn't expect them to break the formula completely this early on, so that was kind of surprising to me. This is definitely the most cinematic episode. It felt like a Marvel movie. I know I complained a lot about the short length of the episodes of the first season of The Mandalorian, and the first few episodes of this season worked for me. I guess this is my one complaint. It worked for me because they were half-hour sitcoms. And this episode, because it was more cinematic and it was more Marvel, it did feel a little short to me, being like 30 minutes. But I don't know. At the same time, I feel like those of us who have been analyzing the episode probably didn't end up learning much from this episode. It was just kind of like a vindication episode. Like, it vindicated all the stuff that we were thinking. Sean, what did you think about this episode?
It's no surprise to anybody. I love the episode. It is the MCU in all the best ways. It's no backhanded compliment from me. I love the way this episode looked. I love the way that it felt. And that's not like I needed this reprieve from sitcom land, because I love that too. I think they did a really great job. And this is actually usually the thing I hate in TV shows is when they break formula and you get the episode that seems to have nothing to do with the rest of the show or the main characters that you've been following. That usually doesn't work for me. In this case, it did because they found ways to make it interesting and tie this into the bigger picture of the MCU in some really fascinating ways. So I loved it. And then as far as the length of the episode, when it ended, I definitely had that reaction of, oh, no way. Like, you got to be kidding me that this one is already over. But I don't know if that's because the episode really should have been longer or I just wanted it to be because I was enjoying it so much.
Brad, what are your brief thoughts?
Yeah, I absolutely love this episode. I even appreciate, that they went back to essentially before, the version of WandaVision that they would end up watching began, so that we could see exactly, where this all started and get acquainted with, the timeline and all that sort of thing. And I was also impressed by how good it looks, even despite being a TV show. We've seen, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., looked like a network TV show that was trying to be set in the Marvel Universe, but they didn't have the money to really bring it, full tilt. And here, the show looks expensive, and it doesn't feel like they cut any corners by any means. Yet it feels right in line with Marvel's work. Arguments can be made for, that there's a little bit of veering into Marvel style that feels like it adheres to a formula that it lacks a certain, auteur style, just because Marvel has a very specific look for most of their movies, even when they bring in directors with specific styles. But I think the show itself is so stylish overall that, that's not really a problem for me. And if anything, it creates a proper delineation between the sitcom faux reality that is happening on the show that is WandaVision and, the real, Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Okay, let's get into the breakdown. Let's just dive into it because we have a lot to talk about this week. The title of this episode is We Interrupt This Program.
Which is perfect.
Yeah, it's perfect. It actually makes me wonder if the next episode is going to be, back to the regularly scheduled broadcast or something.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The opening takes place at the end of the blip. So how awesome was this whole sequence that open, the cold open of the show, I guess is what you call it. What did you guys think?
It was unbelievable. I loved it so much. I mean, the way that they did, just speaking to the cinematic quality of it, the visual effects, the way Monica and everybody else just rematerialized in that scene. No disrespect to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I watched every episode, but yeah, the visual, they clearly spent more money on this than any VFX shots ever in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. At least more of it showed up on screen. I don't know, but it looked great, but it's also what it sold. And it also kind of makes sense because this is the immediate reaction to people coming back from the blip. It's the chaos of it. It's the terror, the confusion of it, the tragedy of it. Like this story for Monica Rambeau that she dozed off while her mother was recovering from surgery, thinking her mother was okay, only to wake up and it's been 5 years and her mom's been gone for 3 of those years. I think it sells when we talk about just the permanent effects of Endgame and this permanent scar that Thanos left, because for anybody who says, well, the Avengers were able to undo it, they can't undo everything. So much of this lasts forever and has, tragic ramifications for so many people, including Monica Rambeau. And so the way they brought all that together, it was staged incredibly well and just a terrific performance by Tiana Paris.
Brad, any thoughts on this cold opening?
No, this was really cool to see because I think that after Spider-Man From Home, a lot of us had questions as to even more so how this would affect, just different parts of the world on, from a small scale to a global scale, as far as what, half of the world's population coming back looks like and the kind of chaos that creates. And it actually made me interested. I would watch an entire miniseries of them doing episodes of this happening in various locations and the kind of panic it causes. I feel like they could do what would feel like a typical network drama about this phenomenon that happened and how it affects just normal people's lives, not even superheroes. Because it was just crazy to watch unfold, everybody coming back, and I'm sure there's even hilarious things that would happen from this. I mean, you have to imagine that maybe at some point in the blip there were probably 2 people being intimate with each other and they just disappeared, and then all of a sudden they reappear in some stranger's bed because they moved into their house.
Right. Well, and I
So
think it sells like because Far From Home does play it for laughs. Like they show the marching band disappearing, then they come back and one of them gets hit in the head with a ball and everything. And
Yeah.
so like, and Aunt May, somebody thought that it was like that they was their husband's mistress or whatever because she reappeared like in her old apartment or whatever that was. And it also makes sense though is because they clarify later in the episode. I mean, obviously we see right here this is the immediate aftermath. WandaVision is actually taking place before Spider-Man Far From Home. Spider-Man Far From Home they say it's 8 months since the blip or people came back. So that also makes sense why they're playing it for laughs when tragedy plus time equals comedy. Like people are probably more comfortable joking about it 8 months after the fact as opposed to immediately when it's happening when everybody's just focused on the chaos of everything.
yeah.
It still raises the question to me: what happens to people who are like on planes or boats? Do they send
the official explanation of that is that it's they call him Smart Hulk for a reason. So like, and the Infinity Stones and the Mind Stone is intuitive enough that it's bring people back safely. So don't bring them back in midair.
See,
who
this
is
is why
it
we
that
have
said
Sean.
that?
Kevin Feige said that actually.
Kevin Feige,
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking that like when she reappeared in that chair, I was like, oh, good thing that chair was like in the exact same part of that room because
Yeah.
it would have been bad if like she just like appeared and then the chair wasn't there and she like
Right.
fell on the floor. No, but I had the same. I really wish that there was a way for Marvel, maybe on Disney Plus or something, to explore this idea of the blip more because I think it is very compelling. There's a part of this episode later on where Monica's walking into Sword and you see on the screens like the celebrations around the world of all these people returning and stuff. I don't know, it just makes like that bit of world building to me doesn't feel like distant mountain kind of stuff. I know
Yeah.
Drew McWeeny has coined that term, distant mountains. It's more of like stuff that I would like to explore. So I don't know. Okay, let's start at the beginning of the scene. It does start on this black screen, and I'm not sure if you guys noticed this. I had to put the subtitles on to like get this exactly, but there's a lot of voice clips from Captain Marvel. So there's like Maria saying, "No, I can't leave Monica," and then Monica is like, "Mom, it's okay, I can stay." Grandma, like, so there's a bunch of clips there. Captain Marvel says, when they were handing out kids, they gave you the toughest one. And then Lieutenant Trouble. So I guess that's probably all just there to key general audiences, not us, not the people that have been picking this apart since the beginning of that this character is the little girl from Captain Marvel.
I feel like that's more for us. I don't think the general audience remembers that Carol Danvers called Monica Rambeau Lieutenant Trouble 2 years ago when they saw Captain Marvel. I mean, unless they've been rewatching, and maybe they have been rewatching Captain Marvel on Disney Plus, but I feel like that's the kind of thing where, I don't know if that immediately signals to the general viewer that this is Monica Rambeau, but it becomes fairly clear soon after that.
Yeah. And I do think one thing that is very clear is the way that she reappears, like just the special effects and all the particles. I feel like everybody, even general audiences, get that. Like they don't need to be told about the blip or that it was about the snap. Like they're like, oh, I know where I am. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just like instantly, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, those particles have that very unique look because you just remember I remember the audience reactions to the opening of Endgame when Hawkeye's daughter disappears. When he turns around and you just see those little particles floating away, like everybody knows what that means. And so to see that same visual consistency of those particles as now they're rematerializing, it worked really well.
Okay, Sean, you're in our Marvel expert seat today. We've known this character as Geraldine, but she is really Monica Rambeau. What backstory should we know about this character from the movies and or comics?
As far as what you should know, I think what they want you to pay attention to from the movie perspective is that, that conversation is, Monica's sense of adventure and wanting to see that in her own mother and in Maria Rambeau, but then also what she says at the end when she's like having the back and forth with Nick Fury, like she can go to space, like you don't know. And she has been to space, as we find out in this episode. So she's definitely been living out this dream and these goals that she was setting for herself back in 1995. So there's that from the MCU perspective. If we're looking at it from the Marvel Comics background, it gets very complicated because she's had like 17 superhero identities. It's more like 5 or 6, but she's had quite a few, including Captain Marvel. She was Captain Marvel in the comic books long before Carol Danvers was ever Captain Marvel, but she's gone by other superhero identities. It looks like Photon has the inside track to be her superhero identity from the comics into the MCU because that was her mom's call sign. And you see that again, Maria Photon Rambeau, in the picture of Maria Rambeau in the lobby of Sword. So it looks like that's the way they're going as opposed to Pulsar or Spectrum. But they have still given her a captain rank. She's a captain with Sword. So really that's the main, I think, thing from the comic books that's worth paying attention to is she does have a superhero background. She's not an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. or agent of Sword. That's not really her role in Marvel Comics. She's a bona fide superhero, and I think that's the direction we're going here.
Yeah. And so far as we know, her mother didn't have superpowers, as far as we know, and she doesn't have superpowers at this moment in time.
Depends on what moment we're talking about.
Okay, we'll get there later. I knew you'd be on that train, Sean. Okay. You know, the in the chaos of this hospital like lobby or whatever it is, hallway, I was kind of thinking like because she bumps into a person, it would have been kind of cool if they could have like snuck in an Easter egg for a future film or show of another character that came back from the blip. Do you know what I mean? Like it would have been cool if like that person was actually someone and we realized that in another scene, but I think it's probably too much production hassle to make
I
that
think
happen.
it's that, and I think it distracts you from the emotion that the scene is trying to achieve. Like it wants you to feel Monica's loss, and you might miss that if you're thinking, "Oh, hey, it's that guy."
Well, it could be a character we don't know yet.
True.
That's what I'm saying.
Very true.
But yeah, okay, so but I guess it would interrupt that character's reappearance in his story. Okay, anyways, Dr. Harley is her mom's doctor. She informs her that her mom died of cancer 3 years ago, 2 years after she got snapped away. So this gives us a timeline. So this is in 2023, but it's further in that year than Spider-Man. Was Spider-Man in 2023?
No, Spider-Man Far From Home presumably would have to be summer of 2024 because it opens with their little in memoriam school video. We throw the news broadcast with Betty Brant. She says that it's been 8 months since the blip. So we've gone through an entire school year in Far From Home. This is immediately after, and then even where WandaVision picks up when we see Monica at Sword, it's been 3 weeks since everybody returned. So this is still like August, September-ish, 2023, well ahead of Spider-Man Far From Home.
It's interesting that we're going to spend a couple of years catching up to where the timeline is in the MCU.
We should point out, though, as timelines go, even with Marvel Studios being involved, Sony Spider-Man movies are suspect as far as where they actually are placed, because we'll all remember the 8 years later title card from Spider-Man Homecoming.
Yeah.
So, and then here we are 8 months later. So the number 8 doesn't work out well for timelines with these Spider-Man movies. So I don't know if we can fully trust it, but for now, WandaVision is happening months before Far From Home.
And I also will note that it's kind of genius that, I mean, they didn't know what was going to happen in our world, but it's kind of a genius set of circumstances that they are able to avoid ever addressing people in masks worldwide. So they never have to address that in the MCU, I guess. Okay, this leads us into MCU opening, which I know Jacob brought up during our first episode, how good it was to hear and see that opening for the first time in a long time. But I feel like it's become the highlight of my week. Whenever that comes on, I'm like, yes, it's time again.
It just gets me so jazzed. It's such a great fanfare.
Yeah. Okay, so we now go to Sword headquarters. The campus looks pretty big. You're in the expert seat, Sean. Who is Sword in the comics? What do we need to know about them?
So the name is actually different. Sword in the comic books is Sentient World Observation and Response Department. In the MCU, they are Sentient Weapon Observation Response Division. There's no and we swap world for weapon and department for division. I don't care about the D part of it.
Why did we do that?
I don't know. I mean, it sounds like, well, they're creating sentient weapons. That is what acting director Hayward tells us, which was not part of Sword's purpose when Monica was there, when she disappeared. So why they changed the name, I'm not sure. but it doesn't really matter to me. Ultimately, it still stands for the same thing. It still results in the acronym SWORD. SWORD in the comic books is effectively Space Shield. And it is very interesting that we say we have an acting director, Hayward, who I don't even know if he's going to survive this series, but that character doesn't really have any strong ties that I'm aware of in the comic books, and I Marvel Wikied it, and I couldn't find anything that I missed. So I don't know about that character in particular. Who knows? For all I know, director Hayward's a Skrull, and that'll come up in Secret Invasion. And really no idea. But
tell me this, Sean. Why
yeah.
is he acting director? What is it, 2 or 3 years after the death of Maria? Like, shouldn't he now be director? Like,
I was also a little bit puzzled by that, but maybe it's because nobody likes him and wants to give him the job. It does sound like the program has kind of been winding down. Like even he talks about it. So it sounds like things just weren't moving at their normal pace during this 5-year period. So maybe that's what it is. The Marvel comic fan in me says, well, he's the acting director because the real director of SWORD is supposed to be a character named Abigail Brand, who would pop up with, her green hair and all. I feel like that's a character who maybe pops up at some point. I don't know if they don't go the superhero route with Monica, she can be the director. But even when Monica and Hayward have that conversation about him being chosen to be acting director and Monica not getting to play a part in that, the conversation wasn't that it should be Monica. It's just that she should have been involved in naming her mother's replacement. But anyway, for my overly, as usual, long-winded answer to this, SWORD is Space Shield is what they are. But obviously they have terrestrial involvement in the MCU because there is no Earth-based shield in the MCU anymore.
yeah. Okay, let's talk about this guy, Tyler Hayward. As you said, he is not a character from the comics. He's played by this actor named Josh Stamberg, who, when I looked him up, it said the first thing it said, he was born in Washington, D.C. And I honestly feel like you can feel that. You can feel Washington, D.C. in his veins. Like he feels like he has appeared in many TV shows as an FBI agent or a cop. And you know why it feels like that? Because he has.
Yep.
He's appeared in 70 TV shows over the last decade, usually in 1 or 2 episodes as an FBI agent or cop. At that point, I'd be like, oh, maybe Sean is right. Maybe this is like a guy that's going to be in there for like 1 or 2 episodes. He's not a major character. That said, he has had some major roles. He had a long-lasting role in the show Drop Dead Diva. He was in like 50 something episodes, and he was in he had a supporting character role in the show Parenthood for 1 season. So it could go either way. But as you mentioned, he's not a character from the comics, but there is a character in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. with the last name Hayward, named Brian Hayward.
Right.
And he's a super soldier created by the Centipede Project. There's been a lot of like coincidental connections to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., the TV show, which I know we've said to death is not connected with the MCU. Kevin Feige wasn't involved. By all accounts,
it is connected to the MCU, but just not in like the way that these new Marvel shows are. Like Kevin Feige was not meticulously planning what happened on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and making it fit in fluidly with the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. They did what they could to make it happen kind of tangentially to the events of the movies.
But what I'm saying is, like,
that only lasted for the first 2 seasons, which actually lines up right to when Marvel Studios split from the rest of Marvel Entertainment. Because
has there been any like references in any of the Marvel movies or TV show, like the MCU movies or TV shows that have referenced any of the events of S.H.I.E.L.D.?
The only thing that even comes close is in the speech that Vision gives in Captain America Civil War, when he talks about since Tony Stark became Iron Man in the 8 years, like the amount of threats has increased exponentially, and superpowered beings it's increased exponentially. And there was a huge Inhuman outbreak in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but that's never really shown up in the MCU proper. And so I think Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., where I place it now, is it's not in like the MCU Prime timeline, but now that we're talking multiverse with the MCU, with a lot of things that are going on, if stuff that's been announced for Marvel Studios, stuff that we know is going on at other studios, it definitely feels like there is this multiverse thing happening, and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is part of a timeline that's connected to the MCU, but it's not the main one. I just don't see that. And even with
Same
this.
with the Netflix shows, I'm assuming.
Yeah, although I don't know, the Netflix shows may get a pass because who knows if Kevin Feige brings Charlie Cox in as Daredevil at some point, maybe he will acknowledge that being part of the same timeline. But even the Netflix shows never interacted with Agents of Shield. The Netflix shows were fairly isolated, so they actually could be brought in, and it would be easier to actually bring those shows in than Agents of Shield because there's a lot less that happened, that you would have to try and account for as far as why didn't all this other stuff pop up in the MCU. I mean, you have many Inhumans in Agents of Shield who are just never a part of the action in the MCU. So I don't really think Agents of Shield is true. I mean, it started out that way for the first 2 seasons, but it diverged on its own path for sure. It had its own branched timeline if we go into Endgame logic and all of that stuff. But as far as the Centipede project, and that's very early Agents of Shield, which is when the ties were closer to the MCU proper. But the timeline doesn't really work out because the sentient weapon creation part of it has been happening in the last 5 years. Those first couple seasons of Agents of Shield are well before Infinity War and Endgame, so I don't really know that connection is lining up. It feels more coincidental than anything else.
What about the blue Hydra soap from the last episode?
I don't buy it because there's no connection for Wanda. These commercials are very clearly about Wanda.
Hydra's connected to Wanda.
Hydra is, but not the soap. And the soap that everybody's talking about doesn't even take place in a real thing in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It happens inside this thing called the Framework, which is this artificial intelligence reality that was created. And yes, it is an alternate reality thing, but Wanda has no connection to that. And she has no way of knowing that Hydra made soap in a reality that didn't exist, and Coulson had to start making his own. So I don't really think that lines up. That feels more coincidental to me than anything else. The main point of the commercial is Hydra, and if we're tracking, we actually are going in chronological order. If we're talking about Wanda's history of trauma, it started, I mean, I don't think it actually started there, but the first story we ever got was a Stark missile, and we get a Stark toaster that takes too long to go off in the very first commercial in the first episode. And then we go to Strucker, who is Hydra, but it's a much more specific thing as far as him being the one who likely captured Wanda and her brother and was running the experiments on them with Loki's scepter, which housed, of course, the Mind Stone. And then we expand out in a broader sense that it wasn't just Strucker, it was this larger thing of Hydra being a source of trauma for Wanda. So I think that really is what it is for me. I don't really think they're trying to, all of a sudden throw a bone to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Maybe they are. They're trying to be kind to the show after the fact, but none of this reads that way definitively for me yet.
Yeah, I think you're right. Okay, so we see a plaque on the wall with Monica's mother's face on it, with a photon, and we see, we find out what has happened to the astronauts training program. It's basically been, I guess, abandoned because half the people disappeared and the other half are afraid to go up there. We see some familiar things in the background, like we see a Quinjet being worked on.
Mm-hmm.
It's cool to see this stuff on, like, a TV show. Hayward Hayward reveals that they have pivoted to unmanned drone missions, robotics, nanotechnology, and AI. He says sentient weapons, like it says on the door.
Mm-hmm.
Monica says observation and response, not creation. Hayward says the world is different now and his face is filled with unexpected threats. So the thing I wanted to pose to you guys, I'll pose this to Brad first, because Marvel Cinematic Universe has a long history of evil government officials who show up to do some bad things. Remember, like, Robert Redford's character, Alexander Pierce?
Yeah.
Alexander Pierce.
Yeah. So, when I see a guy like this, I'm like, oh, maybe he's up to no good. Brad, what do you think? Do we trust this guy?
It's tough to say. It's one of those things where you would think after Shield, was infiltrated by Hydra and was revealed to be this huge evil government organization that we wouldn't be so quick to trust another one. But as we've also seen in the history of many governments, countries, including our own, people aren't always smart enough to avoid those situations. And so, perhaps there's the hope here that maybe because things have expanded so much more as far as our knowledge of what's out there, beyond Earth and in the universe, that this is some, a legitimate organization that's trying to help balance that. You would hope that Nick Fury maybe has some hand in it. I do think the conversation about maybe even Skrull involvement is potentially interesting, and could bring some nefarious activity. Could also just be something that actually helps us in the long run to have knowledge of what else is out there. So there's nothing that I see so far that makes me distrust him, but comic books have also shown that we're not beyond being fooled by these kinds of organizations.
Yeah. What do you think, Sean?
I mean, no disrespect to Josh Stamberg. I'm sure he's a quality individual, but he just looks like a guy you can't trust in this show. So, yeah, of course that dude's up to no good. I think, you see him throughout the show. He's dismissive of Darcy. He's dismissive of Jimmy Woo. And he's totally wrong when he's dismissive of Jimmy Woo, because we lose Agent Franklin, also known as the Beekeeper. Like it seems like this guy is in over his head. And even there's that look that Monica kind of gives him when they have this talk about how awkward it is that he's the acting director. Like, we both kind of know you're not qualified, but hey, you were still there after the blip, so why not?
But he could just be an unqualified, stupid person. It could be this incompetent, not
he could be
a bad guy.
But I think there's a few things to kind of land on. I've mentioned, obviously, there's the possibility that this guy doesn't even survive the end of this series. I'm sure he's going to be in more episodes, but if he makes it out of this series alive and still in this role, it is interesting to see him mention specific things like robotics and nanotech, because that most recently in nanotech, we've heard Tony Stark talking about that a lot. That's the last suits that we saw him using in Infinity War and Endgame. And we know that we have this Armor Wars thing coming up, that it's people going after Tony's technology, and Rhodey's going to be battling against that. So maybe Sword will ultimately play a role in Armor Wars, and maybe Josh Stamberg's director Hayward may come up against Rhodey at some point, although I think they'll probably find a bigger villain for that at some point. But that's something worth keeping an eye on, at least for now. But it's definitely coming to
and we
a
also
head
have
here.
Secret Invasion coming up, so
Exactly, and that's where the
we're gonna
Skrull
have to
theories
replace. Yeah, we're gonna have to replace some of these characters that we know with Skrulls at some point, right?
Very true. But here's my one issue with that in advance with Secret Invasion. I'm very excited about the Nick Fury and Talos team up, because I thought Samuel L. Jackson and Ben Mendelsohn were great together in Captain Marvel, and I'm totally happy to watch an entire show with them. But I kind of hope that there's not too much Secret Invasion stuff going on right here with Sword right now, because what I don't want it to be is a replay of Winter Soldier, where now you have bad Skrulls and Sword standing in for Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. and just being that same thing all over again with these double agents. So I hope there's something more creative and unique about that, but certainly, Secret Invasion is going to be tied into this somehow.
Okay, let's dive back into the episode. Monica has been grounded due to a protocol set up by her mother in case anyone who has disappeared suddenly comes back, which my first feeling, I didn't really think about this. I was like, oh, she thought about something like the possibility of the snap happening.
Mm-hmm.
But then on my second viewing, I was like, oh, no, she knows Skrulls. And she put that protocol into action so that if someone mysteriously comes back, they could be a Skrull. Right?
Maybe, but is this really one of Maria's guidelines, or is that just what acting director Hayward told Monica?
See, this is the problem with unreliable narrators. Sean.
Exactly.
Well, plus though, I mean, she was around, when the blip happened, and so I imagine that was something they probably had to put into place, because okay, all these people are gone. Here's what has to happen if they come back.
Oh, yeah, that could have been a protocol that was made after. Okay, yeah, fair enough. That's smart.
Yeah, and he even says, the positive takeaway from this, which actually makes me trust him less, is because he gives Monica a look on the bright side about being grounded. Is that it meant that her mom believed that she would come back. But there's a few other things that are interesting. Like I like that they establish here that Sword has history that predates Infinity War. And so maybe this is indeed the organization, because Nick Fury has been clearly working with some government organization or agency that isn't actually S.H.I.E.L.D., with whoever the hell they're communicating with. I mean, we know they're talking to Klein, who's the guy who, stood up to Rumlow and everybody else in Winter Soldier before they get blipped in the post-credit scene of Avengers Infinity War. But this organization clearly has been around for some length of time. We're not sure exactly how long. We just know that Maria is the one who supposedly built the place. I also like how the official term for the people who got blipped is the Vanished, and that's something that they've carried forward because that's what they call them in the memorial that Scott visits in San Francisco during Avengers Endgame. So just those little bits that don't really mean anything story-wise, but that sort of consistent continuity is much appreciated by this MCU nerd.
Yeah. I know this probably means nothing, but there's like this big map behind his desk. It's like almost like a star map. It's like a circle. Probably maybe it could be a like map of the galaxy. But while I was watching this episode, I was like, what are they going to make a replica from this episode? Because I don't think there's a thing like the watch or the.
But you've made me think of something else here, though. If that is a star map, maybe the reason he's acting director is because he's never going to be the permanent director because Nick Fury is already out in that space mission we saw in Spider-Man Far From Home. And maybe Nick Fury is the director when he's only acting director while Nick Fury's off Earth.
Well, why wouldn't he tell her that?
I don't know. Maybe he will. And maybe she doesn't. Maybe he's got ulterior motives and that's why he doesn't want to say it. I don't know.
Okay, so Monica is sent on a missing persons case that is in New Jersey. The FBI has requested the use of one of their imaging drones, which is kind of funny to me because like the FBI doesn't have their own drones that they can use, but whatever. And she's going to chaperone the drone. So she goes there and she meets James Woo, who is with the FBI, and we last saw in Ant-Man 2. He was the character that was kind of keeping track of Scott Lang. And interestingly, I'm not. Did you notice the introduction here, the card trick?
Absolutely.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Peter. I immediately thought of you too because I'm sure you had a good chuckle at that.
Yeah, no, it was cool to see Wu present his business card using like the same magic trick that Scott Lang kind of like taught him. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, he was having a tough time of it when he was first practicing in his office in Ant-Man and the Wasp. So I'm glad to see that he's mastered it. He's been working very diligently on his close-up magic.
Yes,
which maybe is a strong clue it's a strong clue that he wasn't blipped because he's had time to figure it out.
I guess that's probably right. That's probably because Ant-Man 2 took place before. No, it took place after the snap, right?
No,
it takes place like concurrently with it, and then we get and then soon after the main story is gone, we get the mid-credit scene, and Wu's gone, or everybody else is gone, but Wu must have still been there and had plenty of time to practice.
You know, after I watch this on midnight when it hits on Thursday, Friday morning for me is like 4 hours of research for this podcast, like trying to put everything together. And I do go like through like Twitter and see what people are talking about and stuff like that, to see if like anybody noticed anything that I didn't. And one thing I noticed that not many people are talking about here in particular is the missing person. Like it seems like a thing that is just put out there of the reason it's like the thing to get them there, and it's like not a big thing. But to me, maybe that missing person is a big part of this mystery.
I think so. Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, because I feel like if the missing person was just a reason to get Jimmy Woo to New Jersey and discover what's happening in Westview, and that, of course, ultimately gets Monica and Sword involved, then I feel like as they're going through this process of IDing people, you ID that witness in this episode, and Jimmy Woo says, that's my guy. But they never mention it again. He just says, I've got a witness set up down the road in Westview, and this morning it looked like he flew the coop. And then it's, of course, going through. They do also use that to illustrate the selective amnesia that some people have, like nobody who knew this person had ever heard of him and all of that. But I feel like you circle back to it and you just close that loop if the witness isn't supposed to mean anything later on down the road. So at this point, I think it's more likely than not, and I'll probably end up being wrong, but I'm with you. I think this is actually going to turn out to be someone significant in this story.
Brad, any thoughts on this one?
No, I hadn't really thought about it, because if anything, I just thought it was the gateway to them, just simply discovering Westview. But it would be interesting if that was a character that did come back to be an integral part of figuring out even more what happened, or maybe even, somebody who wanted to bring attention to the situation without being directly tied to it or something. Who knows?
What was the actor was the person that's playing Ralph on that big board? Because I know
No, 'cause
Agnes was not there.
yeah, Agnes is on the board, just not identified.
Yeah.
Which I think is obviously key for her character, but
We'll talk
uh,
about that in a bit.
we wouldn't know if Ralph was on the board because we've not seen Ralph. But there was no mystery person who was up on the board, who, you know, or we're like, who's that person? We haven't seen it yet. And to even guess that that's Ralph. Ralph so far is just like the sitcom trope of the deadbeat husband that a wife complains about. But I still feel like that could ultimately end up being an actual character in here.
Or maybe he's the missing person. I don't know. Or
Could be.
the witness.
Could be.
Yes. Okay. We'll get to that later. Okay. Not only can he not find the missing person, but he can't find anyone who knew him, and the local law enforcement claims that the town of Westview doesn't even exist, even though the sign is right behind them. So can either of you explain to me what is going on here? Because there's a sign there. There's a town. Are they not able to see it?
Yeah, their mind has been warped in such a way that anything tied to Westview is now as acknowledged as not existing. It's any memory or reference to it has been completely wiped from anybody who was previously aware of it, or at least in that area.
Right.
They do mention an Eastview, though.
I think
Eastview exists.
I think that's just the substitute for like whatever knowledge was there maybe about Westview. Now it's just Eastview.
Yeah, I think so too. I think Eastview is a stand-in for Westview. It's what replaces it for the people that it's been wiped from their minds. And I think Monica is on the right track when she says, like, why can we see it and know that it exists and these other people can't? And yet it's because they have no previous tie to it. And you could say that whoever's generating this reality, which this episode offers an answer by the end of it, I can say that's part of how it's protected, and that's part of how it's insulated from everything else, is that the people who would come looking don't remember it, so they're not going to come look. And they're not going to come look. And also, it's not just the town. Remember what Jimmy Woo says about his witness. All of his known associates and relatives, they acted like they said they had never heard of him. So it's not just the town that's disappeared. It's the people within it have effectively disappeared from the world.
Did he say it in that sex pronoun?
He did say he used he and him when describing the witness.
Because
so I thought the same.
Couldn't be Agnes, right?
Yeah, my first watch through, I actually thought on my first watch through, I thought, oh, it's going to be Dottie, because he's not watching the TV when Dottie appears. He's calling on the radio, but he does use he and him pronouns.
Interesting. Okay, now I know that there's a lot of stuff dropped in the background here. Sometimes it's like an Easter egg. Sometimes it's some kind of clue to let us in on something. I did notice that the cop car is numbered Cop Car 1966, which sounds to me like a year. And I looked up that year. I looked up Marvel. I looked up any kind of character that could be possibly connected to this series, and I couldn't find anything that was introduced in 1966 other than the organization AIM, who I know we've talked about in the past because there's these people in these yellow suits, which I think that thing kind of gets dismissed later in this episode.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think? What do you make of 1966? Is there anything there? Is a reference to anything?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we see the number on the helicopter again as 57, which most likely is a reference to Avengers 57, where Vision debuted. But I don't know anything as far as 1966 that would be specific to this story.
It just seems so specific, right? Like, why not be 66? Or, I don't know. Okay. Monica flies a sword drone into the town, down the street, and it disappears into the energy field. Brad, was it you or was it Ben who predicted that this kind of thing, but we thought it was going to be a real helicopter?
Oh, I think it was me that I mentioned that maybe that the helicopter she found was going to be like, it's funny because I had a grasp of essentially what the concept was, but just not that it was a drone instead of a real helicopter. Yeah,
the only thing that got me when you proposed that theory, I was like, what happens to the people inside? Do they become ants? Like it, but I like that. I like the explanation here. So Monica examines the energy field, and it's kind of like the pixelization on an old television set, and she gets sucked in to the world as we know. The next scene introduces or reintroduces us to Kat Dennings' character Darcy Lewis from the Thor movie. She's now a doctor. Was she a doctor before? She was an assistant,
No,
right?
she was an intern.
Intern, yeah. Um, what do we know about this character? Because it's been a while since I've watched the Thor films.
So we know that she was a reluctant intern. She wasn't going to die for like 12 college credits or something. Like I don't even think, because I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly with Thor, like she didn't even intentionally want to intern for Jane. Like it just kind of ended up working out that way. She had no interest initially in astrophysics. She just ended up being an intern for an astrophysicist. But clearly she gained some passion for it by working with Jane, and she's gone on to get her PhD and everything in the time since we last saw her, which
Yeah.
good for her.
And she probably didn't get blipped away, right? Because that takes time
No.
to get a doctor.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah. She's had plenty of time to take her education seriously and pursue it all the way to receiving her PhD. And I'm happy for Darcy Lewis and Kat Dennings. I've been on that bandwagon since day one. Not everybody loved her in the Thor films. I always thought she was hilarious. And I'll always be grateful to her for Mcu.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that she's an awesome character. And I love that now she's still the comic relief that she was bringing in those Thor films. How's space is still one of the best lines in the MCU, even if it's in Thor: The Dark World. That line cracks me up. But now that she's getting to actually drive plot forward and make one of the key discoveries that I think could potentially be a very, very big discovery, not just in terms of the motivation for setting up a TV. But yeah, I love the role that Darcy's playing in this series based on this episode.
Yeah, a lot of people did not like her. I've always liked Kat Dennings, and I always felt like she was like one of the better parts of the Thor films.
Yeah.
And I feel like this episode for me, even with that, I feel like it kind of redeems her character a bit more. I think it's going to redeem her character. The series hopefully is going to redeem her character in general audiences. Brad, what do you think? What are your thoughts on Darcy?
No, I'm with Sean. I actually always like Kate Dennings in the Thor movies. She brought some comedic relief and was an enjoyable character. And I like them bringing a character like this into these shows and giving her a more significant role, beyond just being a bit more of a, normal person, among all of these, big sort of superhero characters and, government authorities and whatnot. And so, yeah, it's a cool character to have, especially since the vibe that Sword has is, in this series is very similar to whenever there's an alien encounter or something like that, and trying to get devices to figure out what's going on and communicate with people and that kind of thing. So it's fun having her.
Okay, so they've set up a whole tent city, which has been set up on the perimeter of this energy field surrounding the town,
which is also very reminiscent of Thor, where Kat Dennings debuted, because that's what they had a similar thing set up around Mjolnir.
She's just living the same day over and over again.
Just all about that tent life. Although she wasn't in the S.H.I.E.L.D. tent. They were stealing all their stuff. All the music that she just downloaded.
Okay, so Darcy noticed a bunch of cosmic microwave background radiation. That's CMBR.
Yep.
Which contains a signal. Later in the episode, they mention that this kind of radiation dates back to the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the only thing established in the MCU that dates back to the Big Bang are the Infinity Stones. So it sounds like you have a theory here. My theory was going to be that Wanda's powers derive from an Infinity Stone. So like maybe that's why. Is that what you're thinking?
Totally. I think this is the Marvel science of how this is happening. It's accomplishing a couple things. It's how are they able to tune into it? Well, that relic radiation, the CMBR, actually is something that popped up in old televisions. That was the static that you would get like in between channels and the background noise that you would get on an old TV back when antennas were more common for TVs. So that's the way in for Sword to be able to view it. But how has this been generated and constructed in the first place? That if you're talking about radiation that dates back to the Big Bang, because the TV signal isn't the only CMBR. That's a signal that she detected within all of this radiation. So when I think it's clear, if we're talking about these, as Wong says in Infinity War, at the Big Bang, it sent 6 elemental crystals hurtling through the Virgin Universe. One of those being the Mind Stone, which just so happens to be what gave Wanda her powers, or perhaps unlocked Wanda's powers. And maybe she already had it to begin with, which I think this series will eventually answer for us. But yeah, this is how she's doing it. Her Mind Stone enhanced or generated powers are what's creating this whole thing, which I think we would have guessed anyway. If Wanda was going to be the source of it, this is how it is. But I like that there is a more technical pseudoscience-y explanation for it that I think also points to other things happening when we're talking about other characters potentially getting powers. Because they
let's talk about that later.
Yeah. Okay,
I'm on the same wavelength as you there. I think. So she orders the old TV, and they realize that on the TV with the signal, they see a TV show starring Wanda and Vision. And one of the things I love about this episode is like the characters in this episode, the characters in Sword are like just as confused as all the Marvel fans watching the first episode of the show. Darcy questions out loud that Vision is not blipped but dead. So they're like making that clear to audiences, because I know when the show started, that was the question we got asked a lot. Like, wait, did he die or was he blipped? No, he died.
Twice.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's talk about that later, because there's some interesting stuff later with that. The line of the episode for me is Jimmy Woo asking, "So you're saying the universe created a sitcom starring two Avengers?"
Right.
I love that. Also, they confirm my suspicion that at the end of the credit scene for the first episode, it was Darcy watching the TV, although it doesn't feel like they filmed that like congruently, because like they try to cut it into the scene of like she's watching the end of the sitcom with Woo, and they're just like having fun with it. But then like the scene that we saw in episode 1 was like her writing in a journal and putting it down, which is how I guessed it, because I saw a female hand and I was like, female hand, it has to be Darcy. But
there are a couple of inconsistencies. Wanda's delivery of the word "no" from the end of episode 2 is also different in the broadcast we see them watching versus what we witnessed, but I just chalk that up to this is what they chose for editing purposes. I don't know that it's really supposed to mean anything that we're seeing these differences.
Okay, so they begin their investigation proper, and Jimmy Woo is writing questions on a whiteboard. Basically, he's writing all the questions that we've been asking on this podcast.
Yeah, they're doing what we've been doing for weeks. It's great.
It's so weird. It's like an inception of sorts, of like watching the characters on the show analyze the show that we've been analyzing.
And it doesn't make any more sense to them than it does to us. I love it.
Yes. And they put some questions on there that like I said earlier, that I actually thought like might be like things that I was reaching, like the hexagons. Like they said, why the hexagonal shape? Which is something I was like, oh, maybe that's just like a stylistic choice for this television show, and like, based off, the gem in Vision's head, like, maybe there's nothing more to that. Maybe that's like just a visual choice, but it seems like there is something there, because they're putting these questions on a board for the general audiences that don't have this podcast to be like, here's the questions you should be concerning yourself with, right?
Well, I mean,
that's what I think.
I think it's just because they're watching the exact same show that we did for the first 3 episodes, and so they're figuring out things just the same way that we are, and it's because they even have scrolls written on the board as a thing of like is there something here involving them too, So there's they're obviously in our same position, because they're seeing exactly what we saw for those first 3 episodes.
Yeah. And they also don't know. Yeah, they don't know what means something and what doesn't. Why a hexagon? Is that going to be important, or is it ultimately not going to matter what shape this perimeter is? Like, and we don't know.
Yeah, we should also mention that
whatever you can find.
Yeah, the perimeter's 5 miles, and they show this like they have this 3D computer table thing that looks cool, because it looks like it's tech that was made for like Iron Man or Avengers or something, and it shows the perimeter being this energy field that's in the shape of a hexagon. What were you gonna say, Brad? Sorry.
So this episode made me wonder more a thought that I was had at the end of the 3rd episode, which is how the difference in how time is passing between the neighborhood and what's outside, because we finally get to see Monica physically thrown out of Westview, and it's daytime in Westview. But then when she flies out and it lands in the middle of the tent city that S.W.O.R.D. has created, it's nighttime.
Mhm.
So is there any downtime for Wanda and the sitcom world, and as opposed to what's happening outside, or is it all happening, episode after episode, only over the span of what would essentially for us be, and for S.W.O.R.D., an hour and a half?
I think time and space is not working the same way inside that bubble than it is outside the bubble. But I will say, Brad, that this is a question. I'm like such a nerd about those kind of things, and I'm like wondering, they're not they're there for longer than an hour and a half.
Yeah, and
So,
and there's that quick shot we see of Monica in the show, but at a moment that we hadn't seen her yet in the show.
Right. Yeah, the conversation between Agnes and Wanda, which looks like, based on Wanda's pants, it's set during the 60s episode, but it's not a scene we saw during that episode. So other things are happening. Like, I guess the show that we're seeing is a different edit than the one that S.W.O.R.D. is seeing for whatever reason. But I think time is passing in a similar fashion, but it's not quite the same. Like, everything so far in this reality seems to be a day. Day one was Wednesday, August 23rd, on the calendar anyway. And that was the day of the dinner party, which also would have been the day that Monica first went in there, even if she hadn't been fully cast. Because day one, outside of that reality, it begins in the morning in Oakland with Jimmy Woo not being able to track down his witness. A lot happened in that first day, because he says this morning he lost his witness, and by that same day he's in New Jersey and has already tipped off S.W.O.R.D. and already received help. And Monica drove from wherever S.W.O.R.D. is to meet Jimmy Woo in New Jersey. But it's 24 hours later when Darcy arrives. So that's basically day two, effectively. But we also don't know how long this reality was going on before Jimmy Woo noticed that his witness was missing. But in the sitcom realities, each thing seems to be a day. The only thing that throws me off on that is during the 70s episode, when Vision thinks that Wanda is going to have the babies on Friday, she says that's 3 days from now, which it wouldn't be, because actually the 70s episode would be Friday if each episode was a single day. And this is really a very long way of me saying I don't know how time is working inside that reality.
Yeah.
It's very, very weird. It doesn't seem to be exactly the same as what's going on outside of it. But I also like how they explain the noises. All those explosions and loud bangs in episode 2 was all these different drones that S.W.O.R.D. kept flying in there and just losing.
Oh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that's smart. I guess for me, I'm less concerned of like how time works inside the, what do we want to call it? Energy field, bubble, hexagon? I don't know.
You could just say inside Westview. I mean, I don't know.
Westview. Yeah, Westview. Yeah, we could call it Westview. I'm more concerned like how does the time that how are they viewing it outside of Westview is what I'm kind of concerned about. Like, so when that episode ends, what happens after that? Like, is it just off the air? Is it just like fuzz, or like does it replay that episode? Because at one point, like, they interact with the episode where it's, I think even on the board it says same time and space. So they seem to think it's the same time and space.
Well, I think it's a question mark, though. It's their question, same time and space. They don't know. I think that's one of the questions they're trying to figure out, in the same way they're trying to identify why it's sitcoms, why there's a hexagonal shape for this perimeter around Westview. But
by the way, I had this theory on a previous podcast. I'm not sure if you said the same theory on your podcast, Sean, but I wanted to get your thought on this. I theorized that while they were waiting for that bomb to explode or something, that they, like, sitcoms were on, and it was what kept her sane. That's why this is kind of that we're going to learn something like that.
I think the sitcom thing actually even happens before, as I don't know how they're still watching a TV, like after it totally imploded their apartment, wherever they were at. I do think, though, that this is the why sitcoms. I do believe that's definitely been a theory that I've talked about. Like, I think this is in the same way that television and even the MCU in its own way offers escapism for people. That's kind of what it was for Wanda. Zemo says in Civil War that Sokovia was a failed state, long before the Avengers or Ultron showed up. So it wasn't a great, safe place to live. And so for Wanda specifically, but probably also Pietro, like this was safety. It was reruns of classic American sitcoms that were being broadcast in Sokovia. This is what safe and normal and ideal life kind of feels like to Wanda. So this is what she's escaping into and creating and shaping this reality and obviously doing what she can to protect it. And so I do think it's rooted in that. While I don't know if they watched sitcoms while they were waiting for a Stark missile to explode, and thankfully never did, it wouldn't surprise me if we do get a moment where we see, Wanda and Pietro as kids, at that moment where the missile struck, and maybe they are in the room with mom and dad, who may or may not be the two actors who keep showing up in the commercials. And that's when they're watching sitcoms when that first Stark missile hits. It wouldn't surprise me if that's the way it plays out in the show.
I do think that all these questions and things on this board are not just questions that they have, but are things that they want us to think about. The why sitcoms, is it the same time and space? Is Vision alive? Could it be the Skrulls? Are the Skrulls involved? I think they want us to think that, like, are these people, real people, or are they Skrulls? And then there's also a point where, like, it's saying we tried to communicate with them through what, like phone, digital, drone, and eventually that'll lead up to later in this episode where Darcy figures out a way. But I do think that a lot of these things are things that they want us to, as an audience, to think about. It's kind of like putting them on our radar in case we're not,
Oh yeah,
I guess, smart enough to put it, have it on a radar.
I think everybody, they should know that everybody's wondering these things. These are the obvious questions that relate to the show, but it is kind of that way, kind of like we're seeing with the way they're experiencing the show. They're experiencing it like we are. So it's like, yeah, us too, I think is kind of the message of Sword's investigation in this.
Yeah. Okay, so Darcy starts putting names to the cast of characters. Mr. and Mrs. Hart are actually Todd and Sharon Davis. A lot of these names on this, actually all these names, really don't have any connections to Marvel characters or anything. I have noticed that Sharon Davis and John Collins, which are two of the names there, are art directors on WandaVision. So there's a fun tie in there. But did you notice anything that I didn't? Other than
No,
that?
and the names that we get when they play the credits at the end of the 70s episode, when it just cuts away from Wanda confronting Geraldine / Monica, that's also people who work on the show. So yeah, I don't think there were actual Marvel connections there. I think the main point is that these are actual people, because that was one of the questions that was being asked by all of us and being speculated about is, who are all of these people exactly and what is the nature of them? And it's like, no, they're just regular people who are somehow trapped in this.
Yeah. We should note that they all have New Jersey license cards, which leads me to believe that they're probably just people that live there.
Yeah.
But two notable names missing from that list include Dottie and Agnes, although
there's also the mailman.
Oh, the mailman too, yeah. And I'm sure there's some people at that magic show in the town, but they're lesser characters, so that doesn't really, like, non-speaking roles, right? But Dottie, I think you could explain that she hasn't appeared yet, right?
Yeah, she hasn't appeared at that point. And Darcy even says when they're setting up the radio contact, Jimmy's not watching during that moment, which is part of what had me wondering if that was the witness before I went back and re-listened to the dialogue and heard the pronouns. But unless Dottie uses male pronouns in reality, I don't know. But as far as that character, yeah, she just hadn't come up yet in the episodes at that point in the investigation. So that might be why she's not on the board. But I still think Dottie is going to be a big deal. Maybe not as big of a deal as Agnes, but certainly Agnes sticks out like the sore thumb because she's on the board and they can't identify her yet.
Yeah. And they finally realize that Monica's in the show. As you mentioned, they see the sword drone toy, which is in color. Darcy theorizes that it became a toy to render it useless. And I think Darcy's right.
Well, it's also confirmed with the tether for Beekeeper Guy turns into just a jump rope with the part they're able to pull back after he goes through the barrier.
Well, not just the jump rope, but his entire appearance goes from being
Right.
would normally be a biohazard suit to a beekeeper suit, including the
Right.
bees that surround him.
Exactly. Yeah. Which I
Yeah,
do think is an AIM reference, in a comic book way, because their hazmat suits that they wear, they're often referred to as beekeepers. So I do think it's a little nod, but I don't think I don't think it's meant to suggest to us that AIM is back in the MCU. AIM was tied in pretty closely with Aldrich Killian, and not so much their larger thing. Although maybe if we get MODOK in the MCU, we'll get a proper AIM. I don't know.
yeah, that was Iron Man 3, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, oh, and also I was going to mention that on my first viewing, I saw the guy in the hazmat suit go into the sewers while it was raining, and then obviously when he comes out the sewers in the show,
Mhm.
it's not raining. But I think I think that's like a day later, or it's some time later, right? It's not it's still not raining at that point. So, because Brad was saying before the timelines how it is a little bit different. Like she got thrown out, it was nighttime, but there's
Yeah.
daytime in the world. So
Yeah, I mean, he goes in before they've even started watching the show. And so like yeah, it took him a while to get there, and that could be another thing of time working differently. Like, they didn't Monica went in there long before he did, and it took a while for her to actually show up in the reality. So, maybe when you cross through the barrier, you don't immediately pop up in Westview, or even if you do, it takes a while for you to actually get involved in the action.
hmm. Okay, so Darcy has this idea to mimic the frequency of the radio in the show to communicate with them on screen. Wu communicates with Wanda at the poolside community meeting, which we kind of knew because we knew that was his voice. And
Hmm.
I feel like a lot of the show, like this episode, is confirming things that we suspected.
Yeah.
Uh, but it is interesting because from their end, it seems like it doesn't work. Are they seeing a different cut? Brad, what do you think? Are they seeing a different cut of this actual moment for broadcast? Is she like changing the broadcast?
It definitely seemed there is evidence of that. Like very quickly after that something happens where there's some kind of cover up, and that we don't see everything that happens in Westview, and that happens in front of Wanda. So there's clearly some quote unquote editing on the part of Wanda as to what's being put out there, which makes me wonder altogether why it's this is something that's even being put out there in that form. What purpose does it serve? Like, why would she give anybody an opportunity to stumble upon this and potentially try to stop her? Which also feeds into the idea that maybe she's not the only one involved in the creation of this sitcom world, because it would seem weird if she did something that would just give her up. But yeah, so whether it's Wanda that is messing with the actual signal, or if it's somebody else, it's that I don't know.
The other thing I want to mention is that jump rope that like I feel like we've all played with the jump rope of that
Mhm.
quality of like what is it, like 50s or 60s or 70s. Like I know I had one, or we had tons of those in like my gym as a kid. And I think the interesting thing here is not that it turns into a jump rope, but when they reel the steel wire back, they they have a piece of the jump rope in the reality outside of Westview, which to me maybe signals that there's a way to pull things out of the energy field.
Well, and Monica, when she goes through it, she's wearing the same clothes
Yeah.
that she was wearing inside of it.
Mm.
So, yeah, whatever's inside, if it goes through the barrier, can remain intact. Don't know if that principle will apply to Vision. That part will remain to be seen. But yeah, it definitely seems like
Oh,
when you're going through the barrier, you change. But if you're coming out of it, whatever it is, the physical properties remain the same as they were when they were inside Westview.
I just thought of something.
What?
What if the bubble that's surrounding Westview isn't just a force field that keeps it separate from the MCU, but what if it's it has become a gateway to an alternate reality, which is why Vision is somehow back, and maybe that there is a Mind Stone in that alternate reality that she's used to bring Vision back, but only here in the middle of this, neighborhood in the middle of nowhere. That maybe that is like one of the alternate Earths that exists that she's living in.
Definitely possible. I'm just not even sure if Wanda needs a Mind Stone at this point. Like, I feel
That's true.
In some ways her powers almost superseded the Mind Stone. Like, she used the Mind Stone against Vision to push him through the floor and like through the ground all the way to the center of the Earth, just about at Avengers Compound and Captain America: Civil War. So, but yeah, either way, it's Mind Stone stuff, and the idea of it tapping into an alternate reality, I think, is still something that has to be on the table here. But I like the question you posed, though, Brad, of like, if she's letting people see this television show, but she's censoring part of it, like, why let anybody see the show at all? Like, I get why she would want to censor it, because she doesn't want anybody to want to go in because they see people being harmed and people being endangered. But if she's, but she could avoid that entire thing by not broadcasting her show.
Yeah.
Or maybe she doesn't just want to live in a television show. Maybe she wants to be a television star. No, I don't know. One other thing about this is, like, who is controlling what things become when they enter this energy field? To me, I don't feel like, it doesn't seem like Wanda is aware when something comes through the field, because
Right.
she didn't know Geraldine was in there, and she didn't know the plane until she found it. So to me, it almost seems like it's a spell, or what a witch would do is they would maybe put a hex on something,
Mm-hmm.
and a hex is a hexagon. Am I reading too much into things?
I mean, whether or not it has to do with the hexagon, I don't know, but it doesn't. Look, it tracks. Something is going on here. I don't know that it's. I mean, you could say that this reality, it's a thing where whoever set it up, be it Wanda, be it Agnes, be it somebody else, that it's just an automatic thing that as something comes through, it will be modified so that it does not break the reality that they are in. And that may be all that. I don't know that somebody is making an active choice. Like when Agent Franklin goes in, is somebody like hitting a button to be like, who's this guy going to be? Got it. Beekeeper. Or is it just a thing that automatically happens?
Yeah, I think it has to be automatic. And one thing that I wonder about is if is this just Wanda's powers, and if it's Wanda's powers, are these powers that came from the Mind Stone, or are these powers that maybe somehow came from the Reality Stone, which is red, like Wanda's powers, and has the ability to manipulate reality? And we've seen how that works when, Thanos tricked all the Guardians of the Galaxy into thinking that they were coming into nowhere looking completely different when it had already been destroyed by him, and he made it look like everything was fine and abandoned.
But hasn't that stone been destroyed, or actually?
Well, but the stone could be gone. But if her powers potentially came from the Reality Stone, then she would still have the abilities, that stone might have provided her.
Yeah, we just haven't had a connection between her and the Reality Stone in the timeline, though. Like,
right? No, yeah, for sure. We haven't seen it, and so obviously, the stone that was in Loki's scepter is the one, obviously, that would be there.
And ultimately, the reason why the powers may be red instead of any power associated with the Mind Stone, which we've seen blue when it was inside the scepter, and then we see yellow energy, is certainly one of the prevailing theories that's out there, is that the Mind Stone did not give Wanda her powers. The Mind Stone merely unlocked the powers. And did that unlock the mutant gene or some other MCU explanation for how she has her powers? Because we know they experimented on a lot of people with Loki's scepter, and they all died except for Wanda and Pietro, which points to there was already something special within them that allowed them to survive and gain powers. So I take the red as being kind of a Wanda thing, not necessarily a Reality Stone thing. But yeah, that is definitely the color of that stone. And it does have some similar visual components to it besides the color.
Okay, let's get back to the episode. Darcy asks out loud, why are they switching decades? It can't just be for my enjoyment, can it? Now, up until this moment, the switching decades thing, I thought was just like, it just made sense. Like, the next day is this decade, the next day after that is this decade, and they're never going to explain it, and it's just like a fun TV thing to do with the show.
Mm-hmm.
But when you have a character on the show ask the question out loud and you don't get an answer, that feels to me like there's some kind of, this is a question we should be asking.
It definitely is, because Wanda doesn't appear to be making a conscious choice when we transition from black and white to color at the end of episode 2. Like, she's surprised by it when she sees Vision has changed from his head anyway, has changed from black and white to color. And then as color washes over the reality, I mean, we know from other pieces and clips and trailers and stuff that she does have the ability to manipulate things when she wants to, but things are also happening when she's not deliberately choosing it. So that's either her subconscious is powering things and she's not fully in control, or she's not the only one who has the ability to drive this reality.
I think that's probably, Brad, do you have any theories? But I think you've hit on probably the answer, that it's not in her control.
Yeah, no, I mean, because we talked about that before, about how it seems like things are happening that she's not aware of, that she's not controlling, because obviously the neighbors are sometimes talking, and there's times when the people who are being controlled by her are trying to, seemingly snap out of whatever trance they're in, why they're being forced to act this way. So, and aside from that, there are obviously things that are happening that aren't fully in her control. So I think that there's definitely some other influencing power, and as we've talked about before, all signs point to Agnes probably being involved in that somehow.
Yeah. Okay, so Wu and Darcy are basically us watching this show, and when Geraldine says Ultron, they're all like as shocked as we were in that moment. The end of the 70s episode is basically cut out, and Darcy concludes that someone is censoring the broadcast. Then we get to see what actually happened after that mention. We see Wanda's angry. She says Geraldine is not her friend. She is a stranger and an outsider who is trespassing here. She wants her to leave and sends her flying through not only her wall and the fences that surround her house, but many yards through the energy field. Wanda then fixes the damage with her magical powers. Before we get to Vision, because there's a bunch of stuff to talk about here, what do we think about this? Any thoughts, Brad?
I mean, in what way?
I mean, is this what you imagined happened?
Oh yeah, for sure. And that's mostly just because I remembered exactly what happened in the trailers, and so they actually showed a shot of her flying out of the neighborhood. And I think we talked about on the last episode, because when we saw her flying out, I mentioned that we hadn't seen the shot of her being thrown from the neighborhood during the day. And I thought maybe she might go back in and get thrown out for a second time, but this is where that shot comes from, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, so Wanda is admiring the babies when Vision walks in the front door and asks, where's Geraldine? This is the moment we saw before. But when Wanda looks at Vision, he looks like he died. He looks like the moment in Infinity War when the Infinity Stone was ripped from his forehead and his face turned gray. He looks like that, and it's like so very shocking because we've seen this moment before, and it's not something we expect. It's very unexpected. It's very morbid. In previous episodes of this podcast, I've asked if Vision is maybe like recovered data, because they put some data in the computer in Wakanda.
Yep.
And if Wanda was maybe somehow interacting with him in some kind of emulation or something like that, or if Wanda was using a surrogate person to be Vision, like turning someone and imagining their vision, kind of like how Wonder Woman did that in Wonder Woman 1984.
Not quite, but yeah.
But I was imagining. I don't know. That really bothers me about that movie. Okay, but now
it seems like it's even creepier.
Yeah, is she interacting with her corpse? Is she like magically making her corpse, the corpse of Vision, come alive and have sex with her?
I mean, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the case.
They go under the sheets at one point.
They do, but it's also it's sitcom, you know. So not you never know.
Yeah.
No, but
is
it's
Vision even walking and talking in these scenes for real?
Yeah,
Like,
that's what I don't know if she's using like his body and making it move, which would make it infinitely creepier, or if that's just a flash that she has in her mind where it's just a memory, you know, from trauma of seeing him in that way, and because it's showing that she's slowly kind of losing control of what she's seeing and what's happening.
Yeah. Well, and he's not purely a puppet, right? Because he's asking questions and being skeptical in ways that she doesn't want to be. And so that's the part that I think is interesting with Vision, is that he still clearly has some agency in this. It's not like she is completely in control of him all the time. And she even has this little conversation with him. And yeah, the visual of dead Vision from Infinity War was startling, but it's also how Wanda responds to it. Like, she looks away, and this whole thing has been masking trauma, burying it under, and she doesn't actually look back up until he's back to being the Vision that she wants and expects to see. But then the little conversation that they have, where Vision knows the deal here. Whatever this version of Vision knows what's going on. We don't have to stay here. We could go wherever we want. And then she says, no, we can't. This is our home. And he asks, are you sure? And then, oh, don't worry, darling. I have everything under control. Like, that exchange. And maybe she's saying, no, we can't go wherever we want, because if we leave Westview, you're not alive. You're only alive inside here. But Vision still seems to be capable of having a lot of his own thoughts and making his own choices in here. So he's not entirely a puppet. I don't know how exactly this is working. One of the theories is it looked like Shuri did save her work at the end. Like, when she saw Corvus Glaive in Infinity War, she turns back around and hits a couple buttons on the screen. So did she save, did a last save file? And
Sean, I saved my work, and I'm not as smart as Shuri. So, I mean, she definitely did.
Yeah, she totally did. But then also, like, the part of Vision that's missing, and this is the part where maybe Wanda does have influence, is the Mind Stone. They establish in Infinity War, though, that he's not entirely the Mind Stone. He's Tony, he's Banner, he's Ultron, he's Jarvis, he's all of these things, including the Mind Stone. And if Wanda is able to synthesize effects of the Mind Stone in order to create this reality, she's also capable of synthesizing the effects of the Mind Stone to power Vision. So that allows him to have a big part of himself, who he always was, but also this part that she's able to control and manipulate. But it's not her being in full control of it, her only controlling that one part of him.
Last episode, Herb tried to tell Vision, we're all, and then Agnes stopped him. And we were all kind of wondering, what was he going to say? Was he going to say trapped, or was he going to say dead? I know dead's more morbid, and I'm not sure how you follow up with that in a Disney Marvel show. But also, one of the previous episodes, I mentioned that Westview doesn't sound to me like the name of a town, but it actually sounds to me like the name of a psychiatric hospital. And of course, that line of thinking, we're not going in that direction. I think that's been proven that she's not,
right,
controlled by, like, what I was thinking is not happening. But I was wondering, maybe Westview is maybe Westview could be a morgue or a cemetery where Vision was, and she went to visit it and somehow ended up turning it into this town, and it's a town filled with dead people.
I don't think so, just because, I mean, the whole setup for this episode is that they've stumbled upon this town that no one is, aware of or remembers, but there are obviously people who were living in it. And so I would think that they would probably notice a trend of like, oh, here are all these people who are in this town, but they all died years ago. They obviously have their driver's licenses, and they were able to figure out who they are. So I'm sure that Wanda has just taken over a neighborhood that was very much, a normal neighborhood before she came into it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Why this
town? Not all my theories are going to be good theories, guys. Sometimes they have to be the crackpot one.
It's still an interesting question of why this town. I mean, it certainly helps that it's very small. So that is maybe part of the appeal. Is it needed to be big enough to have like that sitcom feel of like the town folk and all that, like makes sense, but it can't be so big that it's going to lead to a lot of questions. Eventually it leads to questions anyway, because it's still enough people that you're going to wonder about all these people who went missing. But I don't think they're all dead anymore. I certainly had that thought. I was like, oh, are they all dead Sokovians and this is purgatory that Wanda has tapped into? That theory seems to be shot. They're all alive. You know, the only one who maybe is not alive is Vision. But then it does lead the question of why Westview, and besides the size of the town, we don't know that Wanda's the one who chose it. And even if she did, we don't know that it was originally her idea. Maybe it's something that she was pointed, maybe somebody else pointed her in that direction. And hell, that somebody else might be Agnes for all we know.
Well, she does tell Vision that they can't go elsewhere. So
Right.
why can't they move? Why can't she move this artificial reality somewhere else? Like, it seems like that would be pretty easy.
Maybe
She created it here. She could create it anywhere.
Well, we don't.
Yeah.
But we also don't know how difficult it was to do this, or
Right.
and how taxing it is on her if she were to try to do it again, especially if she had to get somebody's help to maybe do it.
And also in the scene, Wanda, I think, pretty much confirms that she's in control of this world. And if she doesn't confirm, then, obviously the next scene where Monica wakes up, having been thrown out of the energy field, and she basically says to the audience and to, the sword and everything, it's all Wanda. Then we get a glimpse back inside Westview. Wanda says to Vision, what should we watch tonight? And then there's this look in Vision's face,
Yep.
which I couldn't quite understand it was a weird look. So I do this thing where, maybe you'd call it cheating, where you turn on there is an audio track that's called the audio description track. It's for, I think, people that can't see well or are blind, and it not only has the audio of the show, but it also describes what is happening on the show. And we've used that in the past in the Mandalorian episodes, where it has kind of given us clarity on stuff. Here it says that Vision has an uneasy look. So if you're looking for the intention, if you're looking at what it probably said in the script, it was uneasy look.
Yeah, I think it's him not buying that Wanda has everything under control.
Yeah. Okay, so the music starts playing. It's Jimi Hendrix, Voodoo Child, which I think is not only cool because this is an awesome, 60s or 70s kick-ass song, but these two basically just gave birth to twins, the result of voodoo magic.
Right.
Is there anything else we should be looking into this?
So, well, interestingly enough, there's the longer version of the song is Voodoo Child, and then basically what you would call the radio edit is Voodoo Child in parentheses Slight Return, which kind of seems like an interesting nod to also Vision coming back, but maybe only slightly. But yeah, using this song is not only cool just because reminiscent of the time, but just the implications of that title for sure.
Yeah, the lyrics that play over the credits, it's the portion of the song where it says, "If I don't meet you no more in this world, then I'll meet you on the next one, and don't be late, don't be late." So you could say that's a little bit of Wanda and Vision and their relationship right now. It's not very direct, but I think it's the energy of the song. Yes, the witchcraft that seemed to be involved in the creation of the twins, and that's also another thing. Like, Wanda didn't go into the sitcom reality wanting to have children. That was an idea that was planted in her head by Agnes, and it all involved a For the Children talent show ritual that needed the whole town and Dottie to give them an award afterwards. So there's still other witchcrafty stuff here, and that's why when Monica says it's two lines, it's Wanda followed by it's all Wanda. I believe the first line, not the second one. I believe it's Wanda. I don't believe it's literally all Wanda. I think that explanation, or if it is, I'd probably be disappointed by that explanation because it's too obvious from the comic books with House of M, but it's also too early to give us such an oversimplified explanation and stick with it. This is episode 4 out of 9, so I'm not totally believing it. There's clearly other forces in play that are influencing Wanda, even if she thinks she has everything under control.
Okay, so they sit down in front of the TV, and Vision uses the remote to turn it on. And interestingly, right now the screen goes from widescreen to 4:3 for the first time in this episode. And I'll admit I didn't even notice that the points of the show where it was showing us like the 70s sitcom world weren't in the proper 4:3 aspect ratio.
I think that's because much in the same way it happened in the previous episode when it widened, is the aspect ratio changes when we break the sitcom reality, whether it's by going into the real world of the Marvel Cinematic Universe outside of the sitcom bubble, or by seeing what is actually happening that's not being aired on the TV.
Right.
Yeah. I also think this might indicate that next time when, we have the next episode, which I'm speculating is going to be now back to our regularly scheduled programming, we're going to be back to the sitcom format.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a very safe bet. Okay,
that leads us into our speculation segment. So you guys both agree that next week we're going to get the 1980s sitcom episode?
But what I'm curious about now is, now that we've flashed outside to what is happening with Sword in the real world, if we'll get more cross-cutting than changing back and forth, because now that we know Sword is watching, will we get like analysis going back and forth, in quote-unquote real time as they're watching the show? Or will it be a thing where we'll have another batch of episodes where we're just watching the same way that they are, and then we'll have a whole other episode back with Sword again?
I do think that they are introducing this whole aspect ratio thing so that they can eventually get to the point that they're intercutting and we can easily tell what world we're... I mean, I guess you could tell anyways from the production design, but it is also an indicator of the aspect ratio as well.
Yeah.
What do you think, Sean? Do you think next episode, do you think we'll see an intercut, or do you think it'll be a purely 1980s sitcom?
I don't think it will be purely 1980s. I don't think you can peel back the curtain and show us the other side and then make us forget about it for a week. I could be wrong. It may only take a week for me to turn out to be wrong about that, but I feel like at this point we need to keep track of all the different things that are happening, or at least the main plot lines that we have going here. And so I do think that, I don't know how they'll do it. Like, it may not necessarily be cutting back and forth. They could just open with Sword and then go into the sitcom reality, or start the sitcom reality and then end with Sword, or they could have Sword bookending a sitcom episode, because I do think the runtimes will evolve. I mean, we've consistently had a half hour, but maybe now we push to like 35 or 40 minutes where we still get a full-length sitcom episode, but it is bookended, or it is intercut with some of the things going on with Sword. But I don't think we're just going to completely abandon Sword and go back to just be purely in sitcom world the entire time for next week's episode. I'd be surprised if that's the result.
And I think that if anything, what will happen is we'll probably just start seeing more interruptions as Wanda loses control, or as Sword starts to infiltrate more. Because like, there's even I know one of the things that's coming up that was in, like, I don't know if it was a trailer or a TV spot, but in the 80s sitcom world, there's a part where Agnes like seemingly kind of breaks character, and she's like, oh, okay, like maybe we just take it from the top, and like Wanda looks around confusedly like, wait, what's going on?
And that's a big moment, because in that, I think that's next week, because I think that's 80s. Agnes is wearing her spandex when that happens. And Agnes does a similar trick that Wanda did in episode 2 with the rewind. Like, oh, let's just take it back. And so far, that's only a thing that we've seen Wanda do. We don't know who did that jump cut during the 70s episode, but it was maybe it was Wanda again, another rewind. But when Vision was like saying, I think something's wrong here. But it shows that Agnes has the ability to manipulate this reality in ways that are very similar to what Wanda has the ability to do, which again flies in the face of that idea that Monica communicates at the end, which is it's all Wanda. That's still very honest from Monica's perspective and her experience, because she's only experienced the control of Wanda in this environment. But it seems like there's at least one other player here, and that other player is Agnes, and I think that part will be revealed next week.
So who do we think Agnes is? Because, I mean, do we think she's Agatha Harkness?
I think so.
Yeah, it makes the most sense. I'm sure, obviously, it won't be, as with many Marvel things taken from the comics, it will not be they're not able to do a direct lift or adaptation of who Agnetha is and what she does in the comics, but that she will definitely be represented by this character. As for what she's doing and why, I think that'll be a big reveal for sure.
Do we think Mephisto plays into this at all? I know we've talked about this in the past couple episodes with Jacob, but Sean, I wanted to hear what you thought of that theory.
It's tough. I mean, the evidence is there with, when Agnes even kind of acknowledges that, when Dottie says the devil's in the details, Bev, and then Agnes says that's not the only place he is. So, and Agnes does appear to be genuinely terrified of something. When Herb is about to reveal to Vision the truth of this world, what is Agnes so scared of? Is she scared of what Wanda's powers would be if Wanda is the one responsible for this, and what that would unleash if people break this reality for Wanda? Maybe it's that. Maybe it's Mephisto. Maybe it's the High Evolutionary, who also has ties to Wanda and her origins and everything in the comic books. So those theories are still out there. It feels a little less likely because of how much focus they're narrowing our focus on Wanda right now.
Yeah.
I also feel like with Agnes, it may be a combined thing where she's Agatha Harkness, but in the MCU version, she's also Mephisto, or she's also the High Evolutionary and is maybe playing the role that those characters have played. Because you could say that's Agnes playing Herb in that moment. Like, Agnes is pretending that she's a victim, just like all of them are, but she's the one controlling this whole thing, or she's the one who's controlling it just as much as Wanda is, if not maybe
she kind of
just
controls
a little more.
Herb in that moment, though, doesn't she?
Yeah.
Like, she kind of like controls him not to say anything.
But she plays it like she's scared, like she's begging him, like as opposed to commanding him. She's not using this forceful look toward him saying, like, you better not say it or I'm going to get you. It's more like, please don't say this. But again, that could be a con. That whole thing of like, she's not telling the truth to Vision or Wanda, but she's also not telling the truth to Herb or Jones or Dottie or any of them. Although I still think Dottie is also a witch, because why is Agnes? I mean, you could say that was also a misdirect, and this is why these theories go on forever, is they all have different avenues you can go down, but that could be a misdirect too. Like, Dottie is the key to everything, and I tell you that so that you don't look at me. But Dottie did give the blessing before the pregnancy happened, so Dottie is still worth keeping an eye on, and obviously everybody's watching Agnes very closely.
I'm also confused. Like, I like this theory that they were trying to have them have children, but if I recall, don't they have sex? Like, don't they go underneath the covers at the beginning of the second episode?
They do.
Before all this For the Children stuff comes about?
They do, but it feels like, first off, it's anatomically impossible for a synthezoid to impregnate a human woman. So that's not happening.
Okay, so you don't think it happened in that instant? Okay.
No, it's not a natural pregnancy. Like, yes, they do need to have sex, because Agnes is obviously Agnes is driving that in episode 1. What about seduction techniques? So that is part of the process, but to make sure that sex results in a pregnancy, everything else is for the children. Well, I think it's for Tommy and Billy, and the pregnancy doesn't happen until they are successful at the fundraiser. And Agnes is monitoring. When you watch in episode 2, she's looking closely at the crowd, and she's actually even relieved when the crowd kind of buys the all the bullshit that Illusion and Glamour are selling, that they're not really powered, that this is all cheap magic. Agnes is very kind of happy by that result, and Dottie does ultimately give them the key to everything, which may be bullshit and may be real. And sorry if we're not using PG-13 language on your podcast. I don't know. But you can use a language blurb if you want to, and Steve Rogers me. But I think with this stuff, with the blessing, like the timing to me feels intentional, and they didn't just have a pregnancy when they woke up that morning. It's after everything that was supposedly for the children happened and was successful.
So the bottom line is, we're kind of all on board the train, thinking that this is all like the end goal is to have them have children that someone can steal and use to their own purposes.
I mean, that was sort of the comic book with Mephisto. And so, I mean, it's complicated because the children were real and then they weren't, and then they were again. It's weird. But you could say, is Agnes the one who wants the children because she effectively is Mephisto in this story, or does she want the children because she knows that somebody worse actually wants the children, and Agnes is just trying to get them first in order to help protect them because she knows the children are going to be here either way? Those questions are still, I think those questions are still out there and not totally resolved by the information we got in this episode.
Brad, do you have any other speculation for upcoming episodes?
Not necessarily speculation as far as like what I guess will happen, but that we did see some interesting new things today in the episode promo, or rather, it feels like a season promo for what's coming up on WandaVision after today's episode.
Wait a second.
Oh, okay.
Before you say that, I have not seen this, but I'm not. I don't care about being spoiled. But before you said that, there was one other thing I want to get to in case people don't want to know about that.
Okay.
One last thing. We didn't get to talk about. Shawn was kind of insinuating that Monica got her powers when she gets thrown out of Westview.
Might have.
What do you think?
Well, some of that is also partially informed by a clip of what's coming, ahead in the season. But look,
okay, let's just get into that then.
Okay, yeah.
So if anybody doesn't want to hear us talk about the clip of upcoming episodes, tune out now. Thank you for listening. Okay, go.
So it looks like Wanda is, undergoing kind of a medical checkup. Like, I don't know if it's an MRI or whatever it is. Now, you could say that's just for her head because it seems like, obviously, when she was there, she didn't have a full sense of who she was. And so maybe they're just checking her to make sure, like, her brain's okay. But it wouldn't surprise me if this is how Monica gets powers, because she's gone through this thing, and we know the Mind Stone has the ability to give or unlock powers. Infinity Stones in general have an ability to grant or unlock powers. The Mind Stone's not the only one. Captain Marvel has her powers via the Space Stone with the Lightspeed engine. So that could certainly be something. And also, I mean, it is radiation, and radiation has famously given Marvel characters and other comic book characters powers forever. So there is that part of it. There's also something that when they talk about the radiation getting larger, and I have to credit somebody who's part of my Patreon community and one of my listeners, Alex, who brought this up when we were having a conversation about it the other day. Somebody else lives in New Jersey, and her name is Kamala Khan. And she's an Inhuman in the comics, and that's how they explain her getting her powers. But if you're going to have some big, growing radioactive event, then yeah, this could be Monica Rambeau getting her powers, but this could be taking the place of the Terrigen cloud that gave Kamala Khan her powers, which there's no basis for in the MCU at this point, or not the MCU proper, because they never did Inhumans from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. This could be something that reaches further across the state and unlocks powers for Kamala Khan, and there's our connection for Monica Rambeau and Kamala Khan joining Carol Danvers in Captain Marvel 2. I mean, I know I'm blowing up the balloon too big, and that's probably not what it is, but these are the things I spend my time thinking about.
Hey, I like these theories. Brad, what did you want to talk about in that upcoming preview? I was so busy preparing this episode, I didn't actually get to watch.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Well, so there, earlier this week there was a tease that was meant to be for episode 4, but the footage in it wasn't just footage from episode 4. And one of the shots that we specifically wrote about because it was so surprising and we hadn't seen anything before was from inside some kind of vehicle that looked like it was going through the colorful force field that is surrounding Westview. And so we didn't know exactly what was happening there. But thanks to the new sneak peek that was posted today, we know that it's a sword vehicle and it's ramming into the force field. It's not clear who's driving it or anything like that, but clearly at some point, somebody is going to get inside that vehicle and try and ram through to get into Westview in that vehicle. And then on top of that, also dealing with the edge of the force field, there's a shot of Vision, not in clothes or anything, in his normal Avenger form, walking to the edge of the force field. And then there's a shot of him on the other side in the real world, but he is like in the midst of collapsing to his knees and seemingly screaming in pain. So interesting things coming up on WandaVision.
How can Vision exist outside of Westview? I guess that really comes down to the question of like, what is Vision right now? What are we looking at? What is this creature? And I'm
Well,
not sure any of us have the answer to that one yet.
no, I mean, the comics point us in a direction where there was a point at which Vision kind of lost who he was. And so he was dead and he came back. And that's when you had like white Vision. And so there's already kind of a little setup there with gray dead Vision in the MCU from Infinity War, and that we got a peek of again in this episode. So there is a world in which Vision could be alive. As I said, I mean, whether this is what's happening now or it happens later on down the line, Wanda perhaps using her Mind Stone abilities to synthesize the effect of the Mind Stone as much as Vision needs to be alive. But if it's not fully the Mind Stone, will he be back to being his full and complete true self? And in the comics, he wasn't when he came back, at least not for a while. And then eventually they figured it out. So Vision can have a future outside of Westview. There is a comic book basis for it, but the MCU version may be that, yeah, he may try to leave and be completely unable to and unable to survive outside of that hexagon.
You know, as much as I like him as Vision and I want to see more of Vision, I really am against them doing this thing where they keep on bringing people back from the dead. I know that's a comic staple, but I feel like that's when I read comics that always bothers me because there's no stakes in anything, because someone can die and they can be brought back in any ridiculous way. And if they aren't gone forever, then what's the point? And
It's
also, if he can exist outside of this Westview, then why does he have to live in Westview with her? Why can't they just live in the real world?
Well, don't forget, when as soon as he walks out of that bubble, he seems to be collapsing as if he probably can't survive outside of it.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that we'll get an answer as that he probably, will not be able to live if he walks away from whatever is happening inside this bubble.
Yeah. I don't know if Vision will make it out of Westview. I do think the children will survive. I don't think they only live inside of Westview. Otherwise, why would anybody want them? If their power and mere existence is limited to this area, somebody else other than Wanda wants those kids, Agnes and maybe somebody else as well. So I think the kids will ultimately, and of course, Marvel Comics, Tommy is Speed, Billy is Wiccan. They're young Avengers. Marvel seems to be going in a young Avengers or Champions sort of direction with all the young heroes they're introducing. So they feel like it feels like those characters are going to make it out of here. Wanda will as well. We know she's going to go in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. But yeah, Vision is still a question mark. I'm okay with Vision coming back if he is altered, because there are stakes to it. Because like, even if he was resurrected, he's not fully resurrected and not fully himself. But I do take that point of, you can't bring back everybody all the time.
Yeah, and I feel like I think I agree with what Sean says. I feel like Vision can't make it out of this alive, because as we talked about before, I think Jacob was the one who theorized this, is that it would be, a big deal if, Wanda lost Vision again, thinking that she was able to have this, happy ending with him. And that might send her into a spiral where she truly loses control and makes her the villain of Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness.
Yeah, I think that's where we're headed. But guys, we've been recording for almost 2 hours now, so 4 times the length of the episode that we were reviewing. This has been the longest episode of any of our spoiler reaction podcasts.
I'll take partial credit for that.
Congrats, Sean. Congrats. No, this is a good episode. Where can people find more of your work online, Sean?
You can find me MCU Fan Show. It's the easiest spot to see what I'm up to. It's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, which I don't use as much because not everybody uses it as much. But or if you just search for it wherever you find your podcast, if you search MCU Fan Show, you will find me talking about this show and many other things Marvel.
Yeah, and we're gonna try to get you on for some future episodes. So
yes, please do.
I look forward to that. You can find more of me and Brad at slashfilm.com. You can find this podcast on Apple, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please send us your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, theories. I know we didn't read a lot of them this episode because it seemed like a lot of them were just like kind of answered. this episode, but we love hearing from you. And if you do write us, please leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention the email on the air. And please head on over to our iTunes page, write us like a sentence or two telling us why you like this show, and tell your friends, spread the word, and we'll see you on Monday.